This is Pox You, a Croft and Tabby short, Book 1, written by Brad Magnarella, narrated by James Patrick Cronin. Chapter 1. I came home to find Tabitha washing the dishes. Tabitha, it bears mentioning, is my cat. She didn't hear me above the blasting water. I hung my battered leather satchel on the door-side rack and shrugged out of a snow-dampened coat without moving my eyes from her. The physics alone were amazing. By lodging her considerable gut under the counter, she'd managed to bend over the sink from her perch on a high stool. Her ginger arms, soaked to the shoulders, worked fiercely in the basin. Unbelievable. Even more impressive than the physics was the fact that she was doing any work at all. As I set my cane against the rack, it missed and clattered to the floor. Tabitha raised her head, her ochre-green eyes finding me through the steam. With a scowl, she killed the water. "Enjoying the show?" she asked in a voice that managed to sound languid and biting at the same time. "Can I ask why you're washing dishes?" "Because it's a fucking icebox in here." "Hey, language," I reminded her, adding the mail to the growing collection on the dining room table. Today's haul: 3 bills, a flyer for some sort of city works program, and an ad for women's lingerie. I snorted dryly. Instead of Everson Croft, the ad was addressed to someone named Evelyn Croft. "I thought the hot water and activity would warm me," Tabitha continued, "but it's only put me in a foul mood that has me resenting you even more." Wow, I didn't think that was possible. Does your resentometer go to 11 now? Though she tended toward the dramatic, Tabitha was right about the apartment being an icebox. An early front had caught the city by surprise. Older buildings like ours had yet to switch to their heating systems, and according to our owner, it would be a few more days. He'd lent me a portable heater, but the combo of high ceilings, exposed metal beams, and cold brick walls rendered it useless. Gray snow pelted the apartment's arched double-story windows, while mist scattered from my breath. "And how are the smells in here getting worse?" Tabitha complained. As part of the switching over process, industrial odors had been leaking from the vents all week. "Look, come Monday or Tuesday, the smells will be gone, the apartment will be nice and toasty, and you can go back to lounging in comfort." "I'll be a giant creamsicle by then." At 25 pounds and growing, she wasn't wrong about the giant part. As I joined her in the kitchen, she shook the water from her paws and peered around. I pulled a towel from a drawer handle and tossed it to her. She snagged it with her claws and began drying her matted arms. "How was your day otherwise?" I asked. "How was my day? I'm a centuries-old succubus trapped in a cat's body. When I'm not plotting ways to devour your soul, I'm eating, sleeping, and licking my own—" "All right," I said, raising a hand. "I get the picture." She patted her face dry, tossed the towel aside, and thudded gracelessly to the floor on all fours. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and followed her into the sitting area that faced a massive flagstone fireplace, presently dark. I'd kept my jacket on, and now I resecured my scarf, cinching it tight around my neck. "Why can't you build a fire?" Tabitha pouted. "You know why. The chimney's choking on creosote. It needs to be serviced." "Yes, darling, since April. Can't you cast one of your spells and blast it clean?" "Sounds like a great way to get black lung," I muttered. "No, it costs money to be done properly, and the past year has been tight." As an adjunct professor of mythology and lore at Midtown College, I was pulling in just enough to meet our essential needs, and thanks to Tabitha's expensive tastes, my savings were dwindling in inverse proportion to her swelling girth. She wouldn't allow anything near her palate that wasn't goat's milk or prime cuts of meat. She leapt onto her window-side divan, where I'd set a heating pad and fashioned a thick comforter for her to burrow under. Shoving the comforter aside, she arranged her sizable mound in the divan's growing depression. "Be a dear and plug the pad back in," she murmured. "No wonder you're freezing," I huffed. As I plugged the limp cord into the wall socket, I inspected the rubber insulation. Are those bite marks? I thought I saw it move. And so you attacked the cord powering your lone heat source? It was a reflex, darling. You're the one who put me in this wretched body. Yeah, after you tried to kill me. Oh, let's not rehash ancient history. 2 years ago is ancient history. I'm serious. I've just eaten, and quarreling is only going to upset my stomach. How was your day? The question told me she really was ready to change the subject. Asking after my well-being ran a close second to housework on the list of things Tabitha never did. I lowered myself onto my plush reading chair, body heavy with fatigue. Only 29, I shouldn't have been this exhausted after a week of teaching, but it wasn't just the teaching. It was the wizarding and the stress of balancing the two. Well, my course sizes are a student away from being too small, I said. My last 2 grant requests went unanswered, and I'm pretty sure Professor Snodgrass has spies on me. You're being paranoid? I'm serious. The one day I was late this week, he just happened to be waiting outside my classroom. I didn't know what my chairman liked less, that mythology was being taught in his history department, or that the professor in question was a smug upstart who refused to take his crap. Then stop being late, Tabitha said, all pretense of interest leaving her voice. A little hard when I'm up half the night chasing down a conjuring. But look, it's Friday, I said, bracing the beer between my thighs. I don't want to talk about Snodgrass or conjurings. I just want to relax and— Ow! The serrated edge of the bottle cap had cut my finger. Not a twist-off, I realized. Too tired and annoyed to fetch the opener from the kitchen, I lodged my thumb under the bottle cap and uttered, Vigore. The pressure in the room dropped as the gathered ley energy funneled through my mental prism, down my arm, and out my thumb in a small burst of force. The cap released with a hiss and clanged from the ceiling, but foam was now shooting up the bottle's neck. I clamped the opening with my lips and tried to swallow faster than the foam could fill my sinuses. My eyes watered above my puffed-out cheeks. After several seconds, the foam relented, and I released the bottle with a gasp. Tabitha smirked. Relax, you say? I dabbed my eyes with my scarf, hacked twice, and then attempted a more dignified sip. But the beer was hard to enjoy when it was competing with the room as a colder medium. I should have gone with a Scotch-laced coffee. Shivering, I retracted my neck deeper into my jacket and stared at the empty fireplace. Tabitha followed my gaze. We could be so cozy right now. Can't you use your credit card? Half of New York is in the same boat. Every chimney sweep is going to be booked solid this weekend. Even if you sweetened it with some cash? Sure. Let me know if you find any lying around. I set the bottle on the coffee table and rubbed my chilled hands together. Though irritated at Tabitha's remark, it got me thinking. Ever since the financial crash, cash was king, and it probably wouldn't take much to convince a chimney sweep to bump us up the list. Having a crackling fire in the hearth would be nice. I remembered the flyer in the mail. Cash for labor. If the city was asking, the labor would be something awful, like mucking out an old septic system. But if I had to choose between a dirty job or staying inside all day bundled up like an Inuit and listening to Tabitha, I was pushing myself up to grab the flyer and the gloves out of my coat pocket when a knock sounded at the door. Tabitha and I exchanged questioning looks. We didn't get many visitors. Silence mode, I reminded her. Almost no one in the city knew about my use of magic, and even fewer my talking cat. Beyond the peephole, a young woman who couldn't have been an inch over 5 feet stared back resolutely. I didn't recognize her, and the ward over my threshold wasn't picking up supernatural energy. Probably selling something. Not wanting to rebuff her to her face, I backed away. I saw your shadow through the peephole, she called. Damn. I returned, twisted the 3 bolts, and opened the door. The woman squinted up at me from behind a pair of pink-framed glasses, touches of glittery makeup spangling the skin around her eyes. Can I help you? I asked at last. She relaxed her squint. It's you. I looked around. It's me, who? The wizard guy. I need your help. Chapter 2. I'm sorry, I said, playing dumb. Wizard guy? Can I come in? She asked. It's freezing out here. The young woman tugged the sides of a home-knit beanie over her ears and hugged the arms of a thick coat that had been painted with colorful designs. A large hemp bag hung from one shoulder. Long curtains of sun-kissed brown hair completed her bohemian look. Still, I had no idea who she was. Well, it's freezing in here, too, I said, not moving. You don't remember me? No, you must have the wrong apartment. I was slipping into my wizard's voice, but her eyes, chestnut with a hint of green, sparked something in my memory. More striking was the way they stared, without a hint of self-consciousness. She wasn't a former student. I may have been an absent-minded professor, but I would have remembered someone looking at me like that for 4 months, especially given my small class sizes. Waverly Place, she said, arching an eyebrow. 2 years ago. The power I'd been directing into my voice scattered like smoke. Wait, you were in that group that called up a nether creature. I had just fed Tabitha, still a kitten, and was sitting down to dinner myself when my alarm sounded. The breach was only a few blocks from my West Village apartment. I'd sprinted there, bursting into the basement-level unit to find a large, slug-like creature coalescing over a casting circle. 4 young women, girls, really, were cowering, one holding out a crystal shard like a weapon. A glance around the unit, with its dangling dream catchers, goddess figurines, and books on nature magic, told me exactly what I'd burst onto. A group of mortals who'd bought into the myth that an unwavering belief in their own magic made it so. I trapped the creature in a sphere of hardened air a moment before it started spewing acid, and then dispersed it with my sword. A stray gob shot past my protection, burning away much of my right earlobe. Crazy with pain, I gave the girls a fiery sermon on the dangers of conjuring and how they didn't have a chance in hell of controlling anything they managed to call up, certainly not with the damned crystal. In fact, had I arrived a few minutes later, the slug would have been slurping up their soupy remains. 3 of the girls, including the crystal wielder, burst into tears, but the 4th stared at me unflinching. This was her. Kayla, she said in introduction. Everson, I shook her mittened hand. Don't tell me you called up something else. No, the Coven and I learned our lesson. We only work with terrestrial energies now. We went over this, I said thinly. You're not a witch. You don't have an ounce of magic in you. Maybe not the kind you practice, but... No, I cut in. Not the kind anyone practices. If you did, I'd see it in your aura, and there's nothing there. I was being harsh, but you couldn't sugarcoat these things. I didn't always reach amateur conjurers in time. Kayla shrugged. This isn't about me anyway. Can I come in? How did you find me? I asked, suspiciously. I followed you that night. You followed me? I read about wizards, but I'd never seen one up close. I was curious. Plus, I thought knowing your address could prove useful if I ever needed magical assistance. She opened her hands as if to say, and here I am. How did you even get into the building? Someone was leaving. He held the door open without me even having to ask. It was kismet. I regarded the strange woman. Though I still hadn't entirely forgiven her and her coven for my missing earlobe, something about her impressed me. An event like that night would have reduced most amateurs to a blubbering pile. But not only had Kayla kept her composure, she'd ventured into the post-crash New York night to learn where I lived. That spoke either to bravery or lunacy. Probably both. Fine, I sighed, waving her in. She stepped past me, giving off a scent of patchouli. I almost offered to take her coat before stopping myself, remembering her rail-thin physique from 2 years earlier, hardly an ounce of insulating fat. She peered around the cold industrial loft. It was a lot of square footage for a bachelor and his cat, but apartments like these were still renting for a pittance. The downside was that the owner left most of the upkeep to us tenants. "Love the space," she said, stepping from her yellow rubber boots. "But the energy in here is all blah. And what's that smell?" "The building's changing over to heat. That's why it's so cold." "You can't build a fire?" "Exactly," Tabitha murmured in a way that could have been mistaken for a low yowl. "The chimney needs to be cleaned," I said sternly, directing my voice more toward my cat than my guest. "Aw, a kitty," Kayla cooed, padding toward her. Uh, why don't we do this in the kitchen?" I took her arm and steered her from certain mauling. "I'll make us some coffee." Glaring back at Tabitha, I tapped a finger to my lips to remind her of the no talking rule. "Do you have any matcha tea?" Kayla asked. "No, just Colombian dark roast." "Half a cup, then. Too much caffeine scatters my intuition." "I see." As I prepared the coffee, she hoisted herself onto the counter and peered around, her stockinged feet kicking idly. "You said you needed help?" I prompted. She blinked, as if returning from a daydream. "Do you have any experience with hauntings?" I knew a couple of ghosts in the city, but hauntings weren't really my beat. "Why? What's going on?" "It's my dad. He's a creative, like me, but his mind is trained more toward the practical. He owns a building design firm that specializes in historic restoration, then now architecture. He was just starting to get recognized when the crash hit. The past few years have been shitty, to put it nicely. His firm's scraped by, doing the odd job here and there, making next to nothing. This summer, the city received a private grant to preserve the old smallpox hospital on Roosevelt Island. "Renwick Hospital," I said, recalling the announcement. She nodded. "My dad put in a bid, never expecting he'd get it. Over 50 companies applied. But the city liked his proposal. Work started last month." "That's great," I said, even as I sensed the other shoe dropping. "Yeah, it was going swimmingly until strange things started happening. First, it was just missing tools. The second week, one of the archways collapsed, clobbered a worker. It had just been reinforced, too. My dad oversaw the job himself. He said there was no way it should have come down like that. The city cited him anyway. $5,000. Ouch. I didn't imagine that would do good things for his insurance premiums. Other weird things must have happened that never got back to him because workers started showing up with charms and religious protections while others stopped coming altogether. He hired new workers in their place, but that meant training and the project fell behind schedule. My dad doesn't believe in the unseen world, but I convinced him to take me to the site for a reading. I wanted to roll my eyes, but what Kayla lacked in actual ability, she made up for with sincerity. She peered toward the ceiling and started to tear up. "There was so much pain there, Everson. So much suffering. The children were the worst to bear. I could feel the smallpox ravaging their little bodies." "Here," I held out her half mug of coffee. "Have you heard of Tonglen?" she asked, cupping the mug in her mittened hands. "It's an Eastern practice, right?" "Yes. It's taking on the pain and suffering of someone energetically and giving them your health. I remained at the site for 8 hours practicing Tonglen with those poor souls. I think it helped." I doubted that very much, but I nodded anyway as I waited for the machine to fill my own mug. "Things settled down," she continued, "and the project got back up to speed. My dad thought they might even finish on schedule. And then yesterday, a worker was attacked. He'd gone down to the basement, and when he came back up, he collapsed onto his face. The back of his jacket was blood-soaked. Something had raked him to the bone. While he was being rushed to the hospital, half the crew abandoned the job. My dad spent all day today hiring. If it happens again, it's over. He loses the contract and then now goes under." "So you want me to check out the hospital?" "Could you?" "First, why do you think it's a haunting?" "Old building, history of pain and suffering. and I've read that certain ghosts can inflict scratches. A lot of things in New York inflict scratches, I pointed out. Which is exactly why I need your expertise. Her troubled eyes turned earnest. Tabitha sauntered to the edge of the kitchen, plopped down on her haunches, and cleared her throat. She wanted me to discuss compensation. Well, if I'm being honest, I said, I was planning to stand in the city works line tomorrow. We need the chimney cleaned, and I'm short on cash. Kayla's face brightened. How about this? Take care of the problem and everything will work out. Work out how? I was trying not to sound as hopeful as I felt. It will just work out. I can feel it. I'm an intuitive, remember? Oh, right. My hope deflated. Well, let me think about it. As Tabitha stared at me in disbelief, Kayla reached into her bag, pulled out a black pen, and took my hand. Wet ink tickled my palm as she wrote something across it. When she finished, I turned my hand around and read out a phone number. It's a landline, she said. I don't do smartphones. Wow, something we actually have in common. My magic didn't play well with advanced electronics. I couldn't begin to guess what her excuse was. Kayla finished her coffee in a single tilt and hopped down from the counter. At the front door, she stepped back into her rubber boots, stomping her feet into place. Talk soon, she called confidently, and left. Chapter 3. You're not seriously considering this? Tabitha said as I returned from my library/lab with an armful of books. It's just some background research. There's nothing in it for us, and it's certainly not going to solve our hypothermia problem. I set the books down on the coffee table and shook out my arm. There were times when it was best to ignore Tabitha, but as I sat with the topmost book, a thick tome on the city's history, I paused to consider what I was doing. The case piqued my interest, sure, but there was also Kayla's concern for her father. I don't believe it, Tabitha said. What? She was sitting on the divan, watching me through hooded lids. You've fallen for her damsel in distress act. A totally transparent one, if you ask me. I haven't fallen for anything, I said more aggressively than I meant to. I'd landed in that trap once before in Romania, and it had nearly cost me my life. Look, her father needs help, and this is my job. Your job is conjurings. You're not responsible for the monstrosities infesting this island. Ghouls, vampires, werewolves, succubi, I added, taking a sip of coffee that had already gone cold. My point, darling, is that you could spend the rest of your life running from one end of Manhattan to the other, slaying these things, and you'd barely make a dent. Now, I heard you mention something about standing in the labor line tomorrow. That sounds so much more prudent than working for a lost cause. She shifted her cumbersome body and settled her head on her paws. You think so? I said blandly. Imagine it, darling. A roaring fire in the hearth, the two of us basking in its warmth. You could even bring your bedding out here. I snorted a small plume of steam. And give you a free crack at my soul? No thanks. Her sour face told me I'd seen through her ploy. Then forget the sleeping in front of it part, she said. Just imagine the fire, the warmth. I wouldn't enjoy it, I decided. Not with a potential killer out there. That's my entire point, Tabitha said with a sigh. There are killers everywhere, and they're not your job. Besides, that woman was such a flake. Kayla was more than a little on the woo-woo side, but I kept going back to the fact that she was asking for her father. I fingered my truncated earlobe. Where are you going? Tabitha asked when I stood. Walking to the phone on the kitchen counter, I tugged my gloves off, huffed into my cupped hands, and rotary dialed the number Kayla had written across my palm. She was slightly out of breath when she answered. Everson? I'll look into it, I said, causing her to squeal. Can I meet your dad at the project site in the morning? For sure. I'll get it all set up. Great, I said. Fuck, Tabitha muttered. Chapter 4. The city's F train serviced Roosevelt Island, but I avoided the subway whenever possible. Foul smells clung to the insides of the cars, much like the shady characters who produced them. But more than the smells, I had a problem with being underground. Fine, a phobia. Fortunately, an aerial tram ran alongside the Queensboro Bridge, and I was happy to pay the extra fare. As my tram car rocked 200 feet above the East River, I peered over the slender island. In centuries past, it had warehoused the city's exiled, its first municipal buildings, a prison and an asylum for the inebriate and lunatic. There was also Renwick Smallpox Hospital. Built in the 1850s, the hospital had served as a quarantine and treatment center for New Yorkers afflicted with the disease, mostly poor immigrants and Civil War soldiers. I spotted the hospital's ruins near the island's southern end. In its heyday, it had been an imposing Gothic structure of gray stone. Now, only its main walls rose amid a scant forest, a haunting sight made more so by the threatening sky. Construction fencing enclosed the site, with several vehicles and trailers standing nearby. 15 minutes later, I met Kayla's father outside one of the trailers. He was stocky, bundled in a coat. The face that peered from the wool-lined hood was red from the cold and covered in white whiskers. Frost edged his glasses. "Mr. Starling?" I asked. "Call me Bobby. You must be Emerson." "Everson, actually," I said, though Emerson was a definite upgrade from Evelyn. "Everson it is, then." His harsh blue-collar voice surprised me. It wasn't unfriendly, just a world apart from his daughter's. I accepted his shake, his gloved hand smaller than mine but considerably stronger. "Cold as a witch's tit, huh?" he said, giving my hand a final squeeze. I agreed, even though a witch's breast was roughly 94 degrees Fahrenheit, the same as a human's, and 94 degrees sounded really nice right now. At least the forecasted snow was holding off. I peered around the empty site. "Where's your crew?" "I gave them the day off because of the weather. At least, that's what I told them. I visited Erkins at New York General last night. He's the one that got clawed down the back. Jake Erkins." He shook his head. "Poor bastard's still in shock. I can't send anyone else down there in good conscience. Not until we get to the bottom of this." Understanding the dire time and budget constraints he was under, I admired the gruff man. He had a good heart, like his daughter, which made me feel better about my decision to help them. "Did you tell the police about the attack?" He snorted. "They were worse than useless. Conducted their investigation over the phone and said it was probably one of the island's feral cats." "Cats?" "Yeah. A family of 'em moved into the hospital after it was abandoned in the 1950s. Must be a couple hundred around here now. Most of 'em scattered when we started working, but a few stuck around. There's one now." I turned in time to glimpse a black and white cat darting behind a tree. "I saw Erkins's wounds," Mr. Starling said grimly. "Whatever opened his back wasn't a damned cat. Probably feral, though. I called animal control to see if someone could come down, take a look around, but they don't cover Roosevelt Island." He scoffed. "They're as worthless as the NYPD these days." City budgets all across the country were hurting, but I nodded. He squinted from my cane to my face. "My daughter was a little fuzzy about what you do, exactly." Caught off guard, I stammered, "Oh, I help people." "Like some kind of fixer?" That's probably as apt a description as any. I also teach in the history department at Midtown College. I wasn't sure why I added the last part, probably to sound more legitimate. This was my first time investigating a case that didn't involve an amateur conjurer, and I felt like an absolute poser. "Well, Kayla runs in some interesting circles, but if you can help, I don't care if you shake it for dollar bills on the weekend." I grinned at the image. "Why don't you show me around?" He grabbed a pair of hard hats from the trailer, then walked me toward the front of the old hospital. I followed, affecting a slight limp, my pretext for carrying a cane that concealed a sword and staff. "Renwick Hospital," he announced. Securing the hard hat over my wool cap, I peered up. The ruins were even more impressive and imposing up close. With its pointed windows and crenellated roof, the three-story hospital looked like a cross between a Gothic church and a fortress. Branching tracks showed where vines had once covered its walls. As Mr. Starling led me past the construction fencing, icy winds batted our coats. In my wizard's senses, I picked up a few ghastly energies, but none approached a fully formed specter. Not outside, anyway. "Yeah, so it started with tools going missing," he said over a shoulder. "Thought it might have been the workers. Tough times, you know. But then my cheap measuring tape disappeared, and who the hell would want that? Did Kayla mention the collapse to you?" We'd arrived under the main entranceway, and he pointed straight up. "Happened right here. A half-ton of stone dropped. Just like that." I swallowed, resisting the urge to step from under the arch. "You don't say." "It's safe now. We've finished reinforcing the walls and doorways." He pointed to the steel scaffolding and large horizontal beams. "Still, it's the damnedest thing." He peered up again. "Never should have happened." "Huh," I remarked, stepping forward now. He grabbed my arm. "Careful there. We're still shoring up the foundation. Stay on the planks." Sure enough, a network of wooden boards forded the weed-choked and brick-piled ground. Occasional gaps appeared, some with treetops poking through, openings to a lower level that I'd very nearly arrived at via plunging. Mr. Starling waved for me to follow him along one of the planks. "Down there is where Erkin's got it," he said as we arrived at the top of a descending staircase. I peered into the darkness, the skin over my chest already pulling tight. "Any idea what the hospital used it for?" "Storage, I imagine," he said, telling me he didn't know. "Want me to come with you?" "I should probably go solo. Check it out first." "All right, but don't lean on anything. The support down there is temporary. We were scheduled to install the permanent load-bearing beams today, but then Erkins happened. I'd even be careful about breaking wind if I were you." "I'll clench if the urge arises." "Attaboy. Need a flashlight?" "I'm good," I said, glancing at my cane. "What about a weapon?" "I've got that covered too." "Damn, I forgot your walkie-talkie. Let me run back to the trailer." "Actually, better you don't. I have a way of breaking those things. If anything looks sketchy, I'll come right back out." "Erkins didn't get a warning," he said gravely. I nodded, as much to reassure myself as him. Then, pulse pounding in my ears, I picked my way down the steps. Chapter 5. I waited until I'd arrived at the bottom and was beyond Mr. Starling's sight before giving my cane a twist and drawing out my grandfather's slender sword. "Illuminare," I whispered. The opal inset in the end of the hollow cane, a staff now, glowed to life. The light glinted from the cone pendant around my neck and illuminated my surroundings. I was at the start of a corridor that looked like a small forest. Several trees had taken root in the debris, rising through openings in the ceiling. The pieces of daylight helped my phobia, but the wooden posts propping the ceiling, the temporary support Mr. Starling mentioned, did nothing for my new fear of being collapsed on. Drawing a steadying breath, I switched to my wizard's senses. The illuminated basement retreated into a wash of gray as astral energies grew into my view. Restless energies. As though sensing I was attuned to their frequency, several explored toward me. In the next moment, I was besieged by racking pain and death terrors. I must have made a sound because Mr. Starling called down, "You all right?" "Yeah," I wheezed. "Fine." The energies were emotional residues that had taken root in the space, much like the trees. My protective pendant surged, warding them away. They streamed down the corridor as if returning to a focal point. Might be whatever attacked Erkins, I thought as the basement returned to view. Leading with my light, I made my way after them. Doorways opened to either side, revealing partially or fully collapsed rooms. If the space had been used for storage, the energies down here suggested the stored items had been dying patients. The space may even have served as the hospital's morgue. And I couldn't shake the feeling something hungry was watching me. Catching movement in my peripheral vision, I spun toward the room on my right. From a height taller than my head, A pair of glowing eyes stared back at me. I raised my sword and expanded my light out. An invocation on the tip of my tongue as a strange shape assumed form. It took another second for my brain to correctly identify it as a cat perched atop a pile of bricks. The cat, a scruffy calico, stared back before darting up a tree and disappearing through a hole in the ceiling. 2 more cats followed it. I peered around, my startled heart still hammering. The cats hadn't fled the site, as Mr. Starling believed. They'd gathered down here, on all sides. Feline eyes watched me before flashing away into the deeper darkness. It helped explain the smell, anyway, a combination of wet animal hair and litter box. Ahead, the trees thinned, along with the wooden reinforcements. Beyond the final posts, a collapse blocked the corridor, save for an opening high in the slope of fallen bricks. I approached the hole carefully, leading with my staff. A natural feature of the collapse, I wondered, or the entrance to something's lair. A slip of land in the East River, Roosevelt Island seemed an unlikely sanctuary for a supernatural. They tended to inhabit the city's abandoned subway lines and large parks, but that didn't mean they couldn't come here. Something had gotten its claws into Erkin's. When I'd drawn as close to the collapse as I dared, I reached my staff forward. Light and shadows shifted around the opening. Beyond, the corridor continued a short distance before ending, with 2 final rooms opening off of it. The restless energies I'd sensed upon first entering felt especially intense here. Sweat broke over my forehead as I eyed the opening. Was I seriously considering crawling back there? I felt stupid now for agreeing to a job whose only reward was a vague promise that everything would work out. Maybe I should have listened to Tabitha. With a sigh, I tucked my sword and staff under an arm and began cinching my coat for the tight squeeze. I'd made a promise to Kayla and her father. I checked that my small revolver was still nestled in my right coat pocket. It was, the grip up, cylinder loaded with silver rounds. This is nuts, I thought as I took my first steps up the collapse, bricks shifting underfoot. A cat's hiss sounded behind me, and I turned my head enough to spot the scrawny gray feline. Its teeth were bared, hackles spiking as it backed away. But it wasn't backing from me. A tall figure stood in the center of the corridor. He wore a blue cap, and brass buttons glowed down the front of his frock coat. A Civil War uniform. I was staring at the ghost of a Union soldier. He stared back from a gaunt face covered in blisters. Murky energies spiraled around him, tendrils spiked with pain and terror. I'd found the focal point. More accurately, the focal point had found me. "Hello there," I said carefully. "I'm Everson." My gaze fell to the sword sheathed at the hip of his shabby pants. 3 hard slashes could have opened Erkins's back, no problem. The soldier watched me, eyes edged with fear, or maybe that was what I wanted to believe, that he'd attacked Erkins out of fear. Ghosts weren't souls, they were echoes of the deceased, memories and emotions so intense they became trapped in their final spaces as spectral forms. Either way, I needed to banish this particular specter before it could slash anyone else. But I was too distant, my position partway up the collapse too precarious. The bricks shifted as I adjusted my footing. "I'm on your side," I said, easing my way down. "Go Team Blue." With my third step, I lost my footing, creating a small avalanche of brick debris that sent me stumbling after it. My arrival back on solid ground was so sudden that I landed painfully on my knees. The ghost soldier gripped the hilt of his sword and stepped forward. "No, no!" I yelled, crouching under my staff. "I'm not here to hurt you." Metal flashed as he pulled the slender blade free and raised it. "Intruder," he moaned. Chapter 6. "Respingere!" I cried. Power gathered in the opal inset at the end of my cane and detonated in a burst of white light. As the ghost soldier staggered back, I rose to my full height. Haunted eyes stared from his blistered face. "Yeah, some of us can fight back," I said. The sores bunched around his grimacing mouth, and he charged me with his sword, but I was ready. Gray salt spilled as I drew my fist from a coat pocket. With another shouted word, I opened my hand. The blast of salt met the ghost soldier before his blade could come down, and smoke broke from his reeling form. "Get some!" I cried, adrenaline pumping through me. I'd never battled a hostile ghost before, and it was going even better than I'd expected. All of my late-night studying was paying off, but until I banished him, he remained a threat. Pulling the salt bag from my pocket, I poured a hasty circle over the floor. I backed from it and looked around for him. Where in the hell did Soldier Boy go? Cold fire bit into the center of my back. I arced and spun, a cry lodged in my throat. The pox-covered ghost loomed over me, his next strike already whistling down. I reflexively raised my blade, but I was dealing with an apparition. His slashing sword passed through mine, and I reeled from another bite of cold fire, this one across my chest. Stumbling backward, I landed on the seat of my coat. I expected to find the coat's front flayed open, but it was intact. Not true of the skin beneath. Warm blood was already seeping from the wound, matting shirt to chest, and the soldier was coming at me again. But as I scrabbled back on hands and heels, I trained my eyes on his muddy boots. The moment they entered the circle, I shouted, "Entrappolare!" The salt crystals shifted as energy shot through them, and the specter collided into a rising column of hardened air. He recoiled only to slam into the wall of air behind him. Understanding he was trapped, he began slashing wildly with his sword. Through my connection to the energy, I could feel the strikes. Damn, even those sting. I started into a banishment incantation, taking care to enunciate each word. Flub one syllable, and I would have to start over. The salt kicked into a whirlwind that climbed the specter's boots, then his trousers. When the whirlwind reached his chest, his form began dissolving in gusts of black smoke. "Intruder," he cried above the maelstrom. "Buddy, that's the least of your problems," I thought. The whirlwind soon covered the soldier's diseased face, and a wheezing sound filled his scream before that broke apart too. The salt column gave several more vicious spins before dropping in a messy scatter across the floor. The ghost soldier was gone. Banished. Exhaling, I pushed myself to my feet. The places where he'd slashed me seethed angrily. Touching the opal end of my cane to my front and back, I uttered words of healing. The damage, inflicted by a specter's blade, cut beyond the physical to the astral. I would need to perform more spell work back at my apartment. I peered around. The cats had long since scattered, frightened by the melee. I had the basement to myself, and on an energetic level, it felt as if a great weight had been lifted. I shifted to my wizard's senses. Without the ghost soldier to anchor them, the darker, more restless energies were thinning away. My first non-nether mission was a success. Good. Now let's get the hell out of here, I muttered. Pressing a hand to my wounded chest, I limped from the collapse and up the steps leading back to the surface. Mr. Starling was waiting for me when I came out. "Holy crap, we were just about to head down. Are you all right?" A tall man stood beside him, his coat open to reveal a holstered sidearm. He postured as if he were a cop, mouth set in a surly frown beneath a pair of aviator sunglasses, but the logo on his cap pegged him as private security. "I'm fine," I said, doing my best not to wince from the pain. "What was all the commotion?" Mr. Starling asked. "Did you find something?" I hadn't had time to come up with a story, so I just laid it out. "Yeah, a ghost from the Civil War era. Cavalry from the looks of him. He had a saber, no doubt what he used on Erkins. Caught me a couple times, too." The security guard snorted, but Mr. Starling's expression remained concerned. "I thought Kayla already did something about that." He was referring to her Tonglen ritual, which had done absolutely nothing, but we were talking about his daughter. "Her work probably loosened the lid," I said. "I just gave it the final twists. He's gone now." "A real-life Ghostbuster," the guard deadpanned. "I hope to hell you're not paying this joker." "That's enough, Drew," Mr. Starling said. "You can go now." Good meeting you, Dr. Venkman, the guard said to me with a sneer. As he sauntered away, I resisted the urge to hit him in the back with a force bolt. Mr. Starling looked between me and the stairs. So it's safe for my team to start work down there? Should be. If they encounter anything unusual, give me a call. I can't say I understand what you did or what you even encountered, but if it worked, I owe you. No problem, I said, accepting his vice-like grip again. Snow began falling around us, prompting him to peer skyward. Christ, will you look at that? He released my hand and clapped my shoulder. Go on, Everson. Get yourself home where it's nice and warm. Will do, I said dismally. Good luck. Chapter 7. How much did they pay you? Tabitha called as I entered the frigid apartment. I don't want to talk about it, I said, struggling to twist the bolts home with numb fingers. I warned you about her. You chose to be a chivalrous ass anyway, and now I'm forced to suffer the consequences. I raked my wet shoes aggressively over the mat. Being a chivalrous ass is the reason you still have a head, I pointed out, referring to the night I trapped her succubus spirit in a kitten's body, but couldn't bring myself to decapitate her. Anyway, it's done. The crew at Renwick Hospital is safe. How noble of you. Now, if you hurry, the city might still have a job for you. Not gonna happen. I winced as I stripped my coat off, the healing magic I'd applied at the site already thinning. I've got wounds to tend to. A ghost tried to carve me like a Christmas ham and almost succeeded. I peeked over at her. After 2 years, a part of me was still determined to find even the tiniest spark of caring, fan it into something approaching camaraderie. But it was a futile hope, which Tabitha confirmed by rolling her eyes. So I'm just supposed to lie here and play cryogenic specimen? It would help if you stopped waging war against the power cord, I said with a sigh, plugging her heating pad back in. Did Kayla happen to call? Miss Featherpants? No. Well, that's nice. Risk my life to help her father and she can't be bothered to say thank you? Where are you going? Tabitha asked. I need to take a shower, thaw out some. I'm sorry, darling, but there's no more hot water. She sounded more pleased with herself than apologetic. I used it all up. One frigid shower later, and I was upstairs in my library/lab, feeling even colder than when I'd returned home. I'd examined my wounds in the bathroom mirror. Though no longer bleeding, the gashes on my chest and back were puckered with deep bruising on both sides. Much of that was from the astral damage. Dude had some serious personal space issues, I muttered. Pulling ingredients from shelves, I arranged them across my iron lab table and went to work. I began by grinding limestone and turmeric in a stone mortar, squeezing in the occasional droplet of myrrh oil. When the salve was the right consistency, I scraped everything into a pot on my portable burner and set it to medium. The heat, combined with a series of incantations, activated the advanced healing magic. I loosened the belt around my cotton robe, exposing my chest to the frigid air. Taking a quantity of salve onto the edge of a tongue depressor, I applied it to the wound. The salve magically embedded itself in the exposed tissue, its warmth heavenly. A prickling sensation followed, telling me the salve was working. Now for slash number 2. But when I crooked my arm over a shoulder, I couldn't reach the wound on my back. I tried coming up from the waist, but still couldn't touch it. One of my ex-girlfriends had tried to talk me into yoga. Maybe I should have listened. I searched the lab for a longer applicator before sighing through my nose. Tabitha, I called over the railing. What? She murmured irritably. I need a favor. Silence. There's an extra cut of steak in it for you at dinner. A full minute of grumbling was followed by the sound of her large body thudding to the floor. Moments later, she appeared at the top of the ladder to my library/lab and transferred gracelessly to my table. As she sauntered toward me, She paused long enough to bat the vial of myrrh oil to the floor. "Hey, why'd you do that?" "Cat reflexes," she said. "What do you want?" I returned the vial to its shelf and pulled my desk chair over. "Do you think you can apply that salve to my back wound?" "I don't have opposable thumbs." "No, but you have a paw. A sheathed one, preferably. All you have to do is pat the salve in place. The magic will do the rest." "How big a cut are we talking?" "I don't know, 4 or 5 inches?" "I was referring to the stake." "They're 12-ounce strips," I said thinly. She sniffed the salve and wrinkled her nose. "That's fucking dreadful. 12 ounces seems low." I needed Tabitha's help too badly to scold her about her language. "Low? That's almost an extra pound of meat, but if you'd rather pass, sit down." I straddled the chair backwards, shivering as the robe fell to my waist. "God, that's unsightly," Tabitha said. "The gash? The hair on your shoulders. Can we focus on the wound?" With a sigh, she slapped a paw into the salve and then slapped my back. "Ow! Gently, please. And make sure you're only covering the opening. I want to save the leftover salve." "For what?" "The victim. He's in the hospital, but traditional medicine won't help him." "Why bother?" "Because I can." "All right, it's done," she said, giving my wound a final slap and smear. I waited until I felt the magic tingling deep inside the tissue before standing and securing my robe again. "Thanks," I said, but Tabitha was too busy swearing and wiping salve from her paw to hear me. As I began putting things away, I paused to hover my hands over the portable burner. Man, that felt good. I turned the burner to high. A pop sounded and all the lights went out. Tabitha raised her head. "Now what?" "Just the circuit breaker," I said, cussing to myself as I unplugged the burner. I hurried to a downstairs closet and opened the breaker box. Only there were no switches. I was looking inside an ancient fuse box. Fortunately, I knew a little about fuses, having grown up in an old apartment. Using the light of my coin pendant, I checked each fuse in turn. Sure enough, the one for the upstairs was blown, which, by some chain reaction, had also disabled the main fuse block. Tabitha arrived behind me. "Did you fix it?" "I'm going to have to buy a new fuse." "No problem. I'll pick one up on my way back from the hospital." "And leave me here in Antarctica?" Outside, the snowfall had turned heavy. And was it my imagination, or had it gotten colder? "You're right," I said, rummaging inside the neighboring closet until I found what I was looking for. I stepped over several bundles of firewood from the year before to retrieve it. Tabitha backed from the pet carrier. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Taking you with me." Chapter 8. "Sure you don't want me to drop you in front?" the cabbie asked. "No, over there," I said, pointing to a service drive that ran beside the hospital. "I need to let my cat out to take care of business. She has incontinence issues," I added, purely for my own amusement. Through the pet carrier's mesh door, Tabitha slitted her eyes at me. "I feel you, man," the cabbie said as he pulled into the drive. "My wife has a cat like yours, fat ginger, wouldn't stop leaving us presents on the kitchen floor, so I put her in a diaper. They make 'em for cats now, you know." "Oh yeah? Might have to give that a try." "Do it," Tabitha grumbled, "and you die." The driver laughed. "Did you hear that? Almost sounded like words." I paid him and climbed from the cab's warmth into the raw, wintry afternoon, hefting Tabitha's carrier after me. "I was just beginning to defrost," she pouted as the cab pulled away. "What are we even doing out here?" "The hospital isn't going to let me take you inside." Squinting against the slanting snow, I made my way behind a caged HVAC unit and set her carrier down. "Wait, you're going to leave me out here?" she asked in alarm. I took a dropper bottle from a coat pocket, shook it vigorously, and drew up a quantity of its liquid. I then inserted the end of the dropper through the mesh door. Tabitha's cat instincts overruled her caution, and she gave the end an inquisitive sniff. I plunged it past her lips and squeezed the bulb. Ah, she gagged. Stealth potion, I explained. It'll make you less conspicuous. She hissed, spit, and smacked for several moments before glaring at me. You could have just told me. And debate the issue for the next hour? No thanks. As she swore, I lifted the carrier. By the time I reached the front of the hospital, the potion was taking effect, haloing Tabitha and her carrier in a hazy cloud. The only reason I could see either was because I knew to look for them. Beyond the hospital's sliding front doors, warm air buffeted us. "Oh, that's nice," Tabitha moaned, her voice distant-sounding. "Zip it," I ordered, drawing strange looks from a passing family. At the reception desk, I swapped my personal info for directions to Jake Erkins's room. He was in a wound care unit. With a rich history of elevators stalling on me, I opted for the stairs, exhausted by the time I reached the 5th floor. "Can you stop panting?" Tabitha said. "It's off-putting." "Sure, as soon as you stop being so heavy," I shot back. She might have been invisible to onlookers, but her mass remained substantial. I switched her carrier to my other hand and completed the final flight. The wound care unit was square-shaped, with a nurse's island in the center. In the bustle of personnel, I was nearly as invisible as Tabitha, and the door to Jake Erkins's room was ajar. I peeked inside before slipping through and closing the door behind me. Several IV lines led to a large figure lying prone on a hospital bed. To keep the pressure off his back wounds, I noted. Having suffered less severe cuts from the same blade, I empathized with the man. I pulled a curtain between the bed and door, set Tabitha's carrier on a chair, and snapped on a pair of latex gloves from a dispenser. Just need to apply my salve to the wounds, and I'll be out of here. 3 minutes, tops. I was preparing to draw a sheet back when the bathroom door opened and a nurse appeared with a freshly rinsed urinal bottle. I froze, the corner of the sheet pinched in my gloved grip, and put on my best smile. "Can I help you?" the hefty woman asked. "Oh, his sheet slipped down." I gave it a little tug as if I'd just completed a straightening job. "There we go." "And you are?" "His cousin." Her brow crushed down as she peered between us. Jake was African American. "In-law," I amended. "His cousin-in-law." Before she could suss that out, I asked, "How's he doing?" For a moment, the nurse looked prepared to step up her inquisition, but she slotted the bottle's handle onto a bed rail near his catheter bag. By the time she'd winced herself straight, her face looked tired, overworked. "Stable," she sighed. "The surgeon cleaned and sutured his wounds last night. He's scheduled to transfer to psych. Still not talking." 3 deep strokes from a specter's blade would do that. "How do the wounds look?" I asked. "We just changed the dressings an hour ago. They looked fine." I thought back to my own wounds that morning, puckered, bruised, generally messed up. The blade had inflicted astral damage, and that went beyond the healing ability of sutures and an antibiotic drip. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Are you a doctor?" she snapped back. "Just a concerned cousin." I looked down at Jake. "In-law?" "Well, there you go." She paced from the room, leaving me alone with her patient. A snicker sounded from the bedside chair. "Did you enjoy that?" I asked. "Thoroughly," Tabitha replied, her voice still sounding far away. "It's nice when someone else calls you out on your arrogance." Ignoring her, I drew back Jake's sheet. 3 padded strips ran the length of his broad back, the area covered in a clear adhesive. The surrounding skin was swollen, but nothing like the bruising I'd observed around my own wounds. I picked at the edge of the adhesive. Just a peek, I told myself. Without warning, the bed began to shake. I jumped back as Jake's head snapped around. He stared at me with bugged eyes. Had I hurt him? "Oh, sorry," I stammered. "I'm just checking your wounds." "Beast," he said. "No, I'm Everson." "Beast!" he screamed. I backed away, showing my hands in the "I'm quite harmless" gesture, but the monitor beside his bed began to flash and beep. Wonderful. The door flew open and the same nurse bolted back in. "What did you do to him?" "Nothing," I said. "He started doing that all by himself." Jake was flopping on the bed like a beached whale now. "Beast! Beast!" "Mr. Erkins?" the nurse shouted. "Mr. Erkins, you need to settle down." Unsurprisingly, her voice only stoked his agitation, and the word he kept repeating, "beast," was stoking mine. Seizing one of his flailing arms, the nurse produced a syringe from her pocket, bit off the cap, and plunged the needle into the meat of his shoulder. "Can you grab his other arm before he yanks out his IVs?" she shouted at me. I braced Jake's thick arm. Before long, the sedative began to take effect. His thrashing died down, his cries fell to mumbles, and the monitor stopped beeping. By the time he went still, the nurse's face was shiny with sweat. Her stance toward me seemed to soften, though, as if we'd just gone to battle together. "I need to call his doctor," she said. "It's probably best if you step out for a bit." "Understood. Is there a phone I can use?" Chapter 9. "What's got you so hot and bothered?" Tabitha asked. I held up a finger for silence. We were in a visitor's lounge off the wound care unit, my heart galloping as I read Mr. Starling's number off the card he'd given me and punched it into the phone. After 2 rings, the call went to a mailbox that was full. "Damn it," I whispered. I hung up and tried Kayla. "Oh, don't mind me," Tabitha said. "I'm just the cat." "I think something else might have attacked Jake," I said as Kayla's line began to ring. "Why? Because of what he was shrieking back there?" Her ears flattened at the memory. "He confused the ghost for an animal. Big deal." "That doesn't explain why he didn't suffer any astral wounds," I said. And there was something else bothering me. For the last several minutes, I'd been replaying the encounter with the ghost soldier in my mind. When he'd moaned "intruder," the angle of his raised sword didn't look right. Was he preparing to strike me, as I'd believed at the time, or was he indicating the hole in the collapse? In other words, had the ghost soldier been trying to recruit me to fight the actual threat? "Hi there," Kayla answered. "Hey, it's Everson. I'm so sorry I'm missing your lovely voice." A recording. I tapped my foot impatiently. "We can't question fate, but we can use the moment to suspend this hectic dance we call life and breathe. Slowly in, feel the gift of Gaia's deep and abiding love. Accept it, and slowly out." She released a beatific sigh. "Isn't that wonderful?" "Leave a message, leave a message, leave a message," I muttered. The recording continued in the same vein for another minute before ending with wishes of light and love. "Kayla, it's Everson," I said on the heels of the tone. "This is very important. I need you to tell your father to stay out of the basement at Renwick Hospital. I banished a ghost, but there might be something else down there. I'm heading there now." A click sounded. "Everson, wait!" Kayla's actual voice this time, and it was a far cry from her recorded one. It rang with alarm. "I'm still here," I said. "What's wrong?" "I was supposed to meet my dad for lunch, and he never showed up and didn't answer his phone when I called from the restaurant." "Shit. Where are you now?" "I just got back to the apartment. I heard the end of your message, and now I'm even more freaked out." "All right, stay there. I'm going back to Roosevelt Island." "In my third eye, I keep seeing a skull," she said. "That's only happened once before when a close friend jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge." "I'll hurry. Keep trying your dad." As I hung up, Tabitha said, "Have a nice trip, because I'll be staying inside where it's nice and wah." I grabbed her pet carrier off the neighboring chair and rushed from the unit. For the sake of time, I took the subway and emerged from the Roosevelt Island station with a tight chest, a panicky pulse, and trailing an assortment of ungodly fumes. Veering south through the falling snow, I broke into a run that sent Tabitha into a jostling tirade. A half-mile later, the ruins of Renwick Smallpox Hospital loomed through a wash of gray. "Mr. Starling!" I shouted, arriving at the construction fencing. "Bobby!" The gate in the fencing we'd passed through earlier was open, and I retraced our path over the hospital grounds. "Bobby!" I called from just past the main archway. I stopped to listen. Tabitha had gone quiet too, either from the imposing sight or from being shaken into a stupor. "Here," a hollow voice called. I slipped and scrambled over the wood planking until I reached the staircase to the basement. The security guard I'd met that morning was sitting against a wall, hands at his sides. Drifts of snow covered his shoulders and skewed hat. "Drew," I said, remembering his name. "What happened?" He stared to one side of my face before his shocked eyes found mine. The right thigh of his pants was gouged and blood-soaked, as if he'd been seized and flung. His gun remained holstered at his waist. "It got him," he said through pale lips. "Mr. Starling? Where is he?" Drew's eyes shifted toward the stairs. On the top step lay a glove that Mr. Starling had been wearing that morning. "What got him?" I asked. "The beast." Tabitha's and my eyes met. The same thing Jake Erkins had called his attacker. My mind turned the word into an archetype. Beast, with a capital B. What did it look like? Drew pulled his knees in and turned from the staircase. "The beast," I said, stooping in front of him and setting down the pet carrier. "What did it look like?" But Drew was shaking his head now, as if the danger would go away simply by refusing to talk about it. The ghost soldier had been trying to warn me of the intruder. If I'd listened instead of attacking, I could have learned what we were dealing with. Now, with the ghost banished and Drew in shock, I had no intel. I straightened and looked around. A gray cat peered from behind a nearby brick pile, a rat kicking in its mouth. Unless... Aiming my cane, I shouted a word. Light flashed, and the cat dropped its catch a moment before a shimmering sphere took shape around it. The cat scrambled up and down the sides as I dragged the sphere toward us. "I always figured you for an animal abuser," Tabitha said. I reshaped the sphere so the captured cat was pinned in front of the carrier's mesh door. "What are you doing?" Tabitha demanded. "I need you to talk to it. Find out what's down there." "Talk to it? He's a filthy Tom." The cat squirmed from side to side and began caterwauling. "The sooner we take care of this," I told her, "the sooner we can go somewhere warm." With a sigh, Tabitha fixed her green eyes on my captive. The Tom stared back, his last caterwaul catching in his throat. Though his thick muscles remained coiled, he stopped squirming. Tabitha's succubus and feline powers were working. I glanced at the stairs and Mr. Starling's fallen glove. Given his no-show for lunch and the amount of snow on his security guard, he'd been grabbed at least an hour ago. It would be a minor miracle if he were still alive, especially after what the beast had done to Erkins. God, I didn't want to have to tell Kayla her father was gone, and all because I'd assured him the basement was no longer a danger. "Gross!" Tabitha cried. I looked over to find her recoiling inside the pet carrier, the Tom straining his thick neck forward. His large yellow eyes had taken on an amorous glaze. "Get this brute away from me!" With a word, I dispersed the Tom's sphere, but he used his freedom to poke his tongue through the mesh door. Directing a charge into my cane, I nudged his hindquarters. The Tom leapt a foot into the air and sprinted off through the ruins. "Pervert!" Tabitha scowled. "What did he tell you?" "Things that would turn even a succubus scarlet." "Not that. About the beast." "Sure, it's only my honor at stake." "Tabitha," I said through gritted teeth. She let out a dramatic sigh. "One night this past summer, something came to the ruins. A shadow. It began killing the cats. Too bad he wasn't among the body count." She glowered at the Tom's path of flight. "When the work crew arrived, the shadow went underground and made a deal with the cats. It would stop attacking them in exchange for food offerings. The Tom was making a rat delivery just now." Sounds supernatural, I thought. And if it's communicating with cats, possibly feline. "Where?" I asked. She nodded at the stairs. "In the very back." I tugged my gloves off with my mouth and spit them out. As the second one hit the ground, I drew my revolver and adjusted my grip on my cane. Stay here with Drew. She looked over at the security guard who had gone full fetal. Can you at least place me out of the wind? She said, but I was already hurrying down the steps, a shield hardening the air around me. What if the Tom comes back? She called. I wasted no time reaching the collapse and back. My earlier instincts had been right. The hole was the entrance to a lair. I scaled the slope of fallen bricks and peered through the opening, covering the space beyond with my revolver. Empty, but I could sense the beast lurking somewhere, listening. With more time, I might have set a trap or come up with an ingenious plan, like sending a cat inside with a potion-laced rat. But there wasn't time. The beast had Kayla's father. With a heart-pounding breath, I extended my arms through the opening. My head followed. I shoved with my feet until I was through to my middle. From there, I shimmied, making progress in inches. All the while, I watched the two doorways off the end of the corridor, moving my cane between them. It took me a moment to realize I was no longer moving forward. Damn it. The box of spare ammo in my coat pocket had snagged on a corner of brick. As I reached my gun hand down to work the obstruction free, I felt something large leap onto the collapse behind me. Chapter 10. I struggled to shove myself forward, but a powerful grip seized my right leg below the knee. Sharpness bit through fabric and into flesh. Before I could process the shock, a force jerked me from the hole. I glimpsed a hulking shadow, and then I was ragdolling through the basement's sapling forest. In a white flash, the back of my head struck stone. Debris rained over me as I sprawled across the floor. At first, I could only paw around in a daze. Though I was sore in most places, nothing felt critical. The trees had broken my flight. But my hands were empty, the cane and revolver dislodged back at the hole. No worries, I thought groggily. They were only my offense, defense, and light source. I stopped to feel inside my coat pockets. The dropper bottle of stealth potion was a mess of liquid and broken glass. Healing salve coated the inside of another pocket. In the one below it, my box of ammo was crushed and spilling silver rounds. I remembered Drew's holstered pistol. My silver ammo was probably the wrong caliber, but conventional rounds might hurt the beast enough to send it back into hiding. With a hand pressed to the back of my throbbing head, I squinted around the gloom. Everything was so damned blurry. I couldn't distinguish the light falling through the ceiling from the light of the staircase. Nearby, feral breaths rose and fell. The beasts. Illuminare, I muttered, directing the energy into my coin pendant. The metal glowed bluish-white, illuminating the corridor faintly. In my clearing vision, I was able to get my bearings. The collapse was to my right, the stairs my left. But where was the damned thing? As I pushed myself to a knee, my gaze bounced from doorway to doorway. A figure hulked to my left. I flinched away before recognizing the wooden support. Meanwhile, the feral breathing was getting louder. Wait, I thought. Did the beast leap onto the collapse a moment ago, or drop down? I raised my eyes. At first, I could only see pockets of shadows amid the crumbling brickwork, but something was slipping through those pockets, a sleek mass the size of a racing motorcycle, tail swishing side to side. When it stopped and angled its head, a flash of silver eyes met mine. Fear hit me in a prickling wave. Panther. Worse, its aura tagged it as a shifter, a powerful being that could assume both human and panther forms. The shifter dropped to the floor on all fours, its stealth scary impressive. In the light of my pendant, its coat glistened like oil. The being was strangely mesmerizing, but it was also huge, deadly, and stalking toward me. Unlike the ghost soldier, there was no mistaking this one's intentions. Fangs flashed. Vigore! I shouted. Ley energy rocketed through my body and out my arm. Without a channeling object, the release was disorganized. I pivoted my arm as a set of claws raked the front of my coat. The shifter's fangs snapped inches shy of my face, my force blast having met its belly in the nick of time. As if yanked from behind, the creature flew back and smashed into a wall, sending down more debris from the ceiling. I rose on unsteady legs and staggered from the shifter toward the staircase. I was already rehearsing the moves for when I ascended. Reach Drew, grab gun, turn, fire. But like a current of black liquid, the shifter slipped past me and pivoted. Its head drove into my chest with bruising force. The blow knocked the wind from my lungs and my body into a back roll. I had time to wonder if the shifter was toying with me, a cat with its prey, before it was looming over me. It had risen onto its hind legs, its face more humanoid now. Below its silvery eyes, fangs spread into view, only slightly less impressive than when the shifter had been full panther. "Who are you?" I wheezed. The shifter hesitated, eyes squinting as if trying to recall something. Its humanness, maybe? That happened to shifters who remained in their animal forms too long. They forgot their humanity, or most of it. "What's your name?" I pressed. With a snarl, the shifter fell to its front paws, reared its head back, and released a blood-curdling shriek. The fierceness of the cry suggested the panther was trying to reassert its dominance over its human nature. How long before it decides that ripping apart an actual human is more effective? As if picking up the thought, the shifter narrowed its predatory eyes at me. I raised my hand, preparing another force blast, but the panther arched back suddenly and whipped its head around. It did the same to the other side, swiping and snapping its fangs. Things were falling on top of its back. The cats! Another one plummeted from the darkness, landed between the shifter's shoulder blades, bit down, and darted off. The shifter went into a frenzy, lunging after one cat before another would attack and flee, sending the shifter pitching in the opposite direction. The resident cats were rebelling against their lord. I used the confusion to hustle toward the stairs, but I stopped when I noticed something. The shifter was directly under one of the temporary support structures. "Vigore!" I shouted. The force blast that branched from my fingers caught the wooden fabrication and sent it toppling. The ceiling followed, dropping a massive load of bricks and debris. Cats scattered, and the panther's cry cut out. I wasn't ready to believe I'd killed the thing, but I also couldn't pass up the window for recovering Mr. Starling. I reversed directions, staggering over the still-settling wreckage, and then scaled the collapse at the corridor's end. The adrenaline that fueled me blunted my pain and sharpened my focus. When I reached the hole, I propelled myself through and rolled down the far side. Immediately, an odor of roadkill assaulted my senses. I landed beside my revolver and cane. As I took them in hand, I uttered words of power. Light swelled from the end of my cane and hardened into a shield around me. "Mr. Starling!" I called. I peered into one of the rooms off the end of the corridor. The floor was littered with the bones and bloody tufts of small animals, the cat's offerings to the panther shifter. Otherwise, the room was empty. I squinted as I entered the room across the corridor, mentally preparing myself for Mr. Starling's remains. Instead, the floor was humped with small mounds of debris, claw marks scoring the ground around them. Litter box? I prodded one of the mounds with my cane, breaking it apart, then skipped back as a rat sprang out, squealing. No, this was the shifter's system for storing its prey. Keeps them fresh in here, and then eats them across the hall. Macabre, but as I crossed the room, it gave me hope for Kayla's father. In the back, I found what I was looking for, a human-sized mound against the wall. I ran over and began pulling brick fragments from the smaller end. The edge of a skull appeared, recalling the vision Kayla had mentioned on the phone. Panic soured my mouth before I realized it was Mr. Starling's white-whiskered face. The panther shifter had piled the debris lightly to allow its prey breathing channels. I removed more brick fragments from Mr. Starling's face. He was battered, but alive. I listened for the shifter before clearing the rest of the heavy mound off Mr. Starling and dragging him clear. "Hey," I said, patting his cheeks. Getting back out would be a lot easier if he could walk under his own power. It took several more pats before he blinked his eyes open. He recoiled with a small grunt before recognition took hold. "Everson," he rasped. "It's me," I said. "Can you stand?" "I can try." With my shield enclosing us both, I peered toward the doorway, taking care to search the ceiling too, but we had the room to ourselves. "Thought you'd taken care of the problem," he said, grunting as I helped him to a knee. "So did I. Turns out there was something else down here. Didn't even see what hit me. Stealthy son of a bitch, whatever it was. Strong, too. He stopped to hold his stomach. The front of his coat was torn open like mine, but the flaps of fabric on his were blood-stained. I'd heal him down here if I had to, but I preferred getting him out first. As I waited for Mr. Starling to recover, I thought of the missing tools. That must have been the shifters' first play. Take away enough of their toys and maybe the humans would leave. When that didn't work, the shifter targeted the supports, resulting in the collapse of the main archway. When the humans remained and started poking around the basement, the shifter attacked Jake Erkins before deciding to go full man-eater on Mr. Starling. Thank God I'd reached him in time. "Ready to stand?" I prompted. "All right, count of 3, he said. 1, 2, 3. The force that rammed into the shield sent me staggering and dropped Mr. Starling back to his knee. In the center of the room, the shifter gained its footing and stalked around us with a limp, muzzle withdrawing from its fangs. It had crept in without either of us hearing. "Holy shit," Mr. Starling whispered on a stuttering breath. The shifter was gashed in several places, and no doubt bruised in many others, but the wounds were closing, its strides becoming shorter. In a flash, the shifter leapt atop my dome-shaped shield and began raking it with its claws. Sparks fell over us, and I could feel the protection buckling. "Respingere!" I cried. Light and force detonated from the shielding, throwing the panther into the ceiling. It landed hard on a shoulder and thrashed to its paws, but by its squinting, I could tell the blast of light had blinded it. Waving for Mr. Starling to stay behind me, I drew my revolver, aimed at the shifter's heart, and fired. The hammer registered a metallic click. The hell? I looked down to find the revolver's cylinder angled to one side. I pushed it in, but it wouldn't lock. Some component had been damaged when the weapon dislodged from my grip and tumbled down the collapse. Opposite me, the shifter's nostrils began to flare, its acute sense of smell filling in for its vision. With a word, I threw a sphere of hardened air around the being. As the shifter attacked it, I hunched over the gun, trying to get it to work. "Come on, damn it," I seethed. "Is that a 38 special?" Mr. Starling asked. "Yeah, can't get the cylinder to lock." "Hand it here," he said, still on his knee. I passed it to him and redoubled my grip on my cane, pushing power into the shifter's enclosure. The being's speed, strength, and supernatural nature pushed back. What had begun as a stalemate soon became a losing effort on my part. I was the flagging arm wrestler, watching his sweating knuckles dip by fractions as his opponent claimed the advantage of gravity. "Here," Mr. Starling grunted. He slapped the revolver into my palm at the same moment the enclosure around the shifter fell in a violent splash of sparks. I swung the weapon to my front, working hand around grip, finger over trigger, and squeezed. The tight crack of the shot was followed by the shifter colliding into me. I crashed onto my back, the panther's muscular mass landing on top of me. I instinctively tucked my chin and bracketed my head with my forearms, but the shifter wasn't attacking. It was dead weight. Mr. Starling grabbed the scruff of my coat and dragged me out from under it. Panting, we watched in the light of my pendant as the panther morphed into a human, a slender, muscular man with a mane of black hair and a bullet wound in his chest. Before I could glean anything more about him, his chest sagged and the rest of him followed. Soon, he was crumbling to dust. No more shifter magic to sustain him. Mr. Starling shook his head. "The wife's never gonna believe this." I chuckled in relief. I'd gotten the right monster, this time. Chapter 11. "Let there be light," I declared, reinserting the main fuse block. As if by magic, the apartment lit up, banishing the creeping dusk. It did nothing to the cold, though. "Darling, can you plug in my pad?" Tabitha called in a chattering voice. I closed the door on the freshly installed fuse and emerged from the closet to find Tabitha in a shivering pile on her divan, the power cord for her heating pad limp on the floor. "Again?" I sighed, plugging it back in. Do I need to tape it in place? Even if it manages to stay, I don't think I'll live to see the morning, she said dramatically. A knock sounded on the door, and I jogged the short distance to warm up. Beyond the peephole, Kayla waved at me. I twisted the bolts back. After helping her father from the basement, I'd been able to restore his chief security guard enough to radio for help. I waited with him and Mr. Starling for the ambulances, then got Tabitha and myself out of there before the police could investigate the animal attack. Though I was sympathetic to their budget crisis, I'd heard enough NYPD horror stories to want to stay as far off their radar as possible. "How's he doing?" I asked Kayla as I opened the door. "In surgery now, but the doctors say he'll be fine. They're going to be a bit, so I wanted to stop by. I brought you some dinner." She kicked off her boots and raised a paper bag. "I hope you like raw beet ravioli with soy cheese." Tabitha snorted from the divan. "Sounds delicious," I said, placing the bag on the table. By the time I turned back, Kayla was throwing her arms around my waist and burying her face against the front of my coat. Her voice emerged in a muffle. "Thank you so much." "It was my pleasure." I patted her back a couple times. "Honestly." She remained there longer than felt necessary, or comfortable. Tabitha watched us from the divan. I cleared my throat. "A panther shifter attacked your father." Kayla released me, brow creasing as she stepped back. "Panther shifter?" They're rare beings that can change between human and panther. I don't know where this one came from or how he ended up on Roosevelt Island, but he was more beast than human. Claimed the basement of the ruins as his lair. The resident ghost wasn't happy, but he couldn't do anything against the shifter's innate magic. When your dad's crew arrived, the shifter started attacking them. "You killed him?" I recognized the animal lover in her asking. "In self-defense, yeah." Her eyes searched mine, and she nodded somberly. "I understand. I also know why you helped me." "You do?" "Your father." Her words landed like a blast, and I nearly retreated a step. "What do you mean?" "Yesterday, when I was telling you about my dad, you reacted. It was in your eyes. You have very expressive eyes. There's something unresolved between you and your father." She was cutting really close to the quick. My mother and father had met at a hippie commune in upstate New York, their relationship lasting just long enough for me to show in my mother's belly. My father, who'd gone by no name, decided it was time to ramble on. Heartbroken, my mother returned home. "I never knew him," I allowed. "I didn't know my mother either. She died when I was 1. My grandparents raised me." "You'll meet him," she said. "Your father." Her declaration sent a strange charge through me, and I squinted at her. "How do you know?" "I'm an intuitive, remember?" "Right," I muttered. "I keep forgetting that for some reason." I didn't bother bringing up her everything will work out pledge. "Well, I should probably get back to the hospital." She started toward the door, then stopped. "I have a lot of friends in the 5 boroughs. If any of them need your help with something supernatural related, can I call on you again?" "I'm always happy to consult," I said, "but I can't promise anything. Between my work at the college and my responsibilities to my magical community, I stay pretty slammed. And if I wanted money for future surprises, like another premature cold front, I was going to have to look into part-time work." Someone rapped on the door. "Oh, almost forgot," Kayla said. "I met a woman in the hospital waiting room. Her husband slipped on ice and broke his shoulder. I started into a silent Tonglin for him, but the woman, Betty was her name, asked why I was crying. I was so worried about my dad, it all came pouring out. I must have mentioned your fireplace situation, because in the middle of consoling me, Betty said she knew someone in the chimney business, the grandson of a close friend." Kayla had started turning the bolts as if she were in her own apartment.
I gave her your address, and she said she'd take care of it.
Kayla opened the door onto a man in coveralls hefting a utility bag and standing beside a large vac on wheels. He looked from us to his smartphone. I'm here to clean a chimney for Everson Croft? When Kayla turned back to me, her eyes flashed.
I told you everything would work out.
I'll be damned, I said. Even got my name right. I set another log on the roaring fire that night and settled into my plush chair, my stockinged feet reaching out over the ottoman to absorb the fire's delicious heat. As I moved my steaming mug of cider back to my lap, I peered at Tabitha. I'd pulled the divan beside the fireplace, and her ginger hair blazed like fall leaves. She stared into the flames with half-cocked lids, a long purr burbling in her chest. Told you it would work out, I teased. She tried to make a face, but in the divine warmth, she could only accomplish a half scowl.
Like you knew that.
Maybe I didn't, I admitted, but it's nice to think there are rewards for doing something good, beyond the do-gooding being its own reward, that is. Could be karma, or maybe there really is something to positive affirmation. That's what Kayla did, basically. She affirmed our heating situation would work out if I helped her, and lo and behold, through a series of very improbable happenstances, she was right. I might not buy into her whole I'm an intuitive deal, but positive affirmation I can allow.
You're babbling, darling, and after the day I've had, it's torture on my ears.
Speaking of today, I appreciate your help. Though she hadn't taken credit and would deny it if I asked her outright, I suspected she'd ordered the Tom to lead the cat cavalry into the basement. She may have secretly hoped she was sending the Tom on a suicide mission, but help was help. Maybe you can do more, I suggested. She narrowed her eyes.
What do you mean?
Well, you've proven you have aptitudes besides eating, sleeping, and lounging, and given the circumstances that I'm keeping you alive when by all rights I should have banished you from existence, it's time you started earning your keep.
I pay with my suffering.
You're drinking goat's milk at $20 a pint. She shook her head in annoyance and closed her eyes. I'd like to take you out on future cases, I said. I don't know if I'll need your cat speak again, but you're a succubus. You have insights and perceptions I lack. It's either that or patrolling the apartment ledge. If I end up sticking my nose in the city's supernatural corners, we're going to need better security.
Can you stop talking already? I said I'd think about it.
She'd said no such thing, but that was the closest to agreement I was going to get for now. Snow whispered against the window panes as I sipped my warm cider. I thought about Kayla's declaration regarding my father. I'd always wondered who he was. How could I not? But did I want to meet the man who'd abandoned my mother and me? As I considered the question, the fire blurred and my eyelids grew heavy. I snorted awake without realizing I'd drifted off. The fire had gone green, and there was a weight on my stomach. When I blinked, I realized I wasn't looking at the fire, but Tabitha's eyes. They were inches from mine. She'd stalked onto me when I dozed off, and now a soul hunger burned deep in her stare. All right, I said, lifting her off me and setting her back on the divan. Time for this wizard to hit the hay.
You're no fun at all.
Yeah, well, I prefer my soul intact, thanks. We'd made some progress on our relationship this weekend, but we still had a long way to go. Tabitha watched me hungrily for another moment before her eyes dimmed and she settled back down.
Good night, darling, she murmured.
Night, Tabby. Thanks for listening to Pox You, the first in the Croft and Tabby series. If you enjoyed this story, please like and comment to let us know. And don't forget to subscribe for more audiobooks set in the Croftverse. For Everson Croft's backstory, and to learn how he and Tabitha met, be sure to check out the Prof Croft prequels, also available on this channel. When you're ready for the main series, the 32-hour Prof Croft box set is now on Audible. Pox U, a Croft and Tabby short, was written by Brad Magnarella. Narrated by James Patrick Cronin. Produced by Blue Nose Audio. Production coordination by Candace Lawrence. Post-production by Michael Straza. Copyright 2021 by Brad Magnarella. Production copyright 2021 by Brad Magnarella. All rights reserved.